Channel 5 network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris here on a Tuesday, and we've got a good show on tap. I'm very excited about our guest this morning because we're going to be talking about something that I think fascinates me, and I hope fascinates many of you 50 years ago, all right? I mean, the historic Apollo 11 launch leading to the moonwalk and Neil Armstrong and everything else that came with it. It's hard to believe it's been 50 years. Okay, yeah, I'm old enough to remember where I was when this happened, all right? Just barely watching in the basement with my folks. But it was a thrill, and what that moment meant, not just then, but even today. And as you're watching a lot of, I think, the video that's being aired by local newscasts and a lot of the talks going on, reminding of what we did then and where we go now, that's really what this is all about. And here's the historic launch. We'll have video we'll show you throughout this program today. But the key today is we're going to have a guest on. I'm going to introduce you in just a moment, who was actually there the day of the launch, who is now over at Vanderbilt University, knew the astronauts, actually knew Wernher von Braun as well, in terms of the construction of the rocket, which remains to this day the largest ever launched off this planet. And we'll show video and some stories as we make our way, but I want to introduce you now to Professor Robert Odell from over at Vanderbilt.
Good morning, Rick.
Good morning to you, sir. Distinguished research professor, Department of Physics and Astronomy over at Vanderbilt. And just sitting down and talking to him, the show came up and said, Nick, here we go. And I'm sitting here talking to him because I'm so fascinated to hear from you and what you know about this. And before we get to any video, and we'll take phone calls as well, if you would, sir, let's touch back on what we were just talking about. The day of the launch, you were there. Give me a little bit of your background and what you knew. You knew the astronauts and that day.
I was a young professor at the University of Chicago at that time. A few years before launch, I had become a consultant to Wernher von Braun, the man who led the development of the moon rocket, the Saturn V rocket. And Wernher and I were talking about the future of the Marshall Center after the Apollo program, so he was thinking already 10 years ahead. And he had arranged for me to come to the launch to be in the so-called VIP area, but not in the control room. So it was fun to be there, the great anticipation, and also to treat the people who were involved as people I knew, friends at some level. So it wasn't just a national program that was being carried out there, but it involved the lives of people.
We've talked about how this rocket remains to this day the largest. I guess you said Russia had one that didn't ever really, take off, but this was the biggest ever. I'm wondering, that day as you were sitting there and you knew these people, there were personal relationships, you knew the astronauts, how confident was everyone at that point that this rocket was going to make it out of the atmosphere and make the trip? I mean, this was a first, all the research, all the work, but really you didn't know till it launched. How was there apprehension?
Of course, because this particular mission had never been carried out before. There were preceding Apollo missions that led up to this point, but the actual touchdown had never been done. You can simulate things in a computer, till the cows come home, but it's not like everything has to work.
Right.
And you don't know it's going to happen until it has. So, yes, everyone was puckered up, but everyone was confident.
Yeah, confident. It had to be awesome. You knew all three of the astronauts on board?
Only socially.
Socially, but knew of them, and as you told me before the show, all three of them very confident as well, and understood the burden of what they were going up on and what they were representing, don't you think?
Oh, yes. It wasn't just a personal thing for them, but they knew they were part of this whole phenomena of the space race against the evil empire of the Soviet Union. So they knew it was something for the country and not just an adventure.
Let's remind folks just how this whole space race kind of got going. It was 1961 when President Kennedy, I think up until that point, Russia was known for maybe having, technology-wise, better booster rockets than us. They were ahead of that, and Kennedy wanted to come up with a plan where, for national pride and everything else, something where we're all starting at ground zero on just an incredible task, saying, before the end of this decade, let's get to the moon. And the race started. And it was important to him that we beat the Russians. Is that accurate?
Oh yes. And in fact, it was there at the Rice University Stadium that he made his famous national vow that we should put men on the moon by the end of the decade.
At that point, they hadn't even been working on that yet.
That's right. And it was
like,
just,
what?
Just mind-boggling because our capability with rockets at the time was so limited and indeed inferior in terms of load carrying capacity to that of the Soviets. Our rockets were more sophisticated, more reliable, and therefore the potential for growth was there.
Okay.
Where the growth did occur with the Soviet rockets, but they never became as sophisticated or as reliable in those early days.
And do you believe the competition and the drive to beat the Soviets was much of what drove the program for the rest of that decade leading up to the launch and the landing on the moon?
Oh yes, because it's hard to realize today that Russia being what it is, just what a surprise that is a modern nation. How relatively unsophisticated technologically the Russians were. And the American view was there were a bunch of peasants with communists as their leader. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, to the public, they were able to put a satellite up, a dog up, to put a man, a woman, and we're still plodding along trying to do the same things. What a tremendous surprise. It felt threatening because both countries had nuclear weapons.
Yeah, the Cold War.
And so just the fact that they could do it was perceived as a threat to national security.
So that drove it, and then let's get back up to the 50th anniversary today. Does it feel like 50 years to you? Does that time, and has the space program since that day grown as you thought it would or not? I mean, so much has changed.
It certainly feels like 50 years, but since it's an important part of my life, as many people, you remember everything. About it.
Yeah.
Now, on the question of what people thought lay ahead really depends on the person, because NASA had a crisis after the Apollo program of what do you do next?
Yep.
And after, Vice President, then President Johnson was a supporter of the space program, no doubt about it. But when Richard Nixon came on board at the end of or near the end of the Apollo program, the landings, the question became, do you set new national goals in space, such as continue going to the moon or go to Mars? Develop use the enthusiasm for the Apollo program. And all those dreams just kind of evaporated. I happen to have served on the transition team of Nixon as a as he was coming into office, of people were giving him advice on the space program. And we laid out a very elaborate program whose main goal was directed towards landing on Mars. This is now almost 50 years ago.
Wow.
And that's where we are
now
today.
That's what we're talking about.
But there was a loss of enthusiasm for the space program.
And that, of course, translates because then the money, which is needed. Listen, we need to take a break. When we come back, pick up on that as well. I want to talk a little bit more just about that day, of course, and the launch, rather. And then, what was it, 4 days later that Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. We'll talk about that. We can take some questions from a man who obviously knows the program very well and was there the day of the launch. And we'll talk more about the fact, as he just said, only now, 50 years later, we're kind of talking about going to Mars. And there's private rockets, or maybe you can book a seat if you're a millionaire. We'll take a break. Be back with your calls. A billionaire, I suppose. It's expensive. With our guest, Professor Robert Odell, right after this. Stay with us.